Money does not change people. It just strips away their masks. When the lawyer slid the paper declaring me the sole heir to $31 million across the desk, my mother slowly lowered her designer sunglasses. She glared at me like a parasite and hissed, "You do not deserve a single cent." She had no idea that those cruel words were the spark needed to detonate the fake empire she and my father spent a lifetime building. Hello, everyone. Before today's story begins, we'd like to share a quick message. YouTube recently removed our monetization, cutting off our income. If you enjoy this story, we humbly ask for just $1 to help pay our staff so they can make a living and keep creating for you. Thank you for saving us. Now, let's begin the story. My name is Claire Holmes. I was deep inside the basement archives of the Hawthorne Institute of Antiquities in Chicago when the phone rang, shattering the heavy silence. The air around me was thick with the familiar, comforting sense of decaying parchment, cracked leather bindings, and the sharp bite of restoration chemicals. This windowless room was my sanctuary, far away from the noise of the outside world. I wiped the solvent from my gloved hands and picked up my cell phone. An unknown number flashed brightly on the screen. I answered, pressing the cold glass to my ear. "Hello?" I said softly. "Is this Claire Holmes?" a deep, gravelly voice asked. "Yes, speaking." "Claire, my name is Elias Thorne. I am the attorney for Arthur and Beatrice Vance. I am so sorry to be the one to tell you this, but your grandparents passed away peacefully last night at their farm in the Willamette Valley." The words hit me like a physical blow, stealing the breath right out of my lungs. The quiet hum of the Institute's ventilation system faded away into white noise. My grandparents were gone. Arthur and Beatrice Vance were the only two people in this world who ever truly saw me. They lived a life of quiet, unpretentious labor in Oregon, most people looking at their calloused hands, their faded flannel shirts, and the beat-up truck they drove for over 20 years would never guess the truth. My grandparents held confidential aerospace engineering patents worth tens of millions of dollars. They were wealthy beyond imagination, yet they chose the smell of damp soil and the honest sweat of farm work over any luxury or status. They were the exact opposite of the world I was forced to grow up in. My parents, Richard and Sylvia Holmes, resided in a sprawling, debt-choked mansion in San Francisco. Their entire existence was a carefully curated illusion built on a precarious foundation of unpaid bills and crushing desperation. Richard was a fraud masquerading as a visionary tech entrepreneur, spending his days spinning webs of lies to bleed venture capitalists dry. Sylvia was a ruthless social climber whose mood depended entirely on whether she was invited to the right high society charity galas. Then there was my older brother, Julian. He was the golden boy, the flawless heir apparent, and the perfect, obedient puppet for my parents. He played his role beautifully, and his absolute favorite pastime was joining Richard and Sylvia in their relentless daily campaign to make me feel utterly worthless. For 28 years, I was nothing more than a ghost haunting the marble halls of my own childhood home, an afterthought, a disappointment to the family name, the only time my lungs ever fully expanded, the only time I felt the warmth of genuine, unconditional love was during those fleeting summer months I spent at the Oregon farm, out there among the hazelnut trees. I was not a burden, I was just Claire. And now, the only two people who had ever offered me a safe harbor were gone, leaving me completely alone to face the storm that was about to break. The memorial service was held under the unrelenting gray skies of the Willamette Valley. My mother treated the muddy Oregon graveyard like her personal, mourning-themed fashion runway. She wore a tailored black designer dress that undoubtedly cost more than the mahogany casket itself, topped with a dramatic, sweeping veil designed to hide eyes that had not shed a single tear. My father, Richard, was equally appalling. He saw the gathering of my grandparents' former aerospace colleagues not as a solemn memorial, but as a prime networking opportunity. I watched from the shadows of a weeping willow tree as he aggressively gripped the hands of retired engineers and defense contractors. His face was contorted into an exaggerated, theatrical mask of sorrow, yet his free hand was constantly, subtly slipping his venture capital business cards into their palms. It was a grotesque, nauseating performance. Richard and Sylvia wept loudly whenever the audience around them was large enough, aggressively dabbing their dry eyes with monogrammed silk handkerchiefs. But the exact moment the crowd thinned, their postures straightened perfectly, their eyes darted around the manicured lawns, silently calculating the net worth of everyone present and whispering about the liquidation value of the farm. Julian stood right between them, nodding solemnly to the guests, playing the role of the tragic, grieving grandson with a sickening, practiced perfection. Throughout the entire agonizing afternoon, I stood entirely alone in the drafty corner of the reception hall. My family did not look in my direction once. They did not offer a hug, a word of comfort, or even a brief nod of acknowledgement. To them, I was entirely invisible, a ghost taking up space. The only person who approached me all day was an older man with sharp, fiercely intelligent eyes and a neatly trimmed silver beard. He walked past my parents, ignoring their outstretched hands, and stepped directly toward me. He placed a gentle, grounding hand on my shoulder. "I am Elias Thorne," he said quietly, his voice a steady anchor in the storm. "Your grandparents loved you very much. Be ready for tomorrow." Tomorrow arrived in the form of Elias Thorne's polished mahogany office in downtown Seattle. The large room smelled of expensive leather, aged paper, and an impending storm. The air inside was so thick with tension it felt physically hard to breathe. Richard, Sylvia, and Julian sat shoulder to shoulder on the plush leather sofa, practically vibrating with a greedy, desperate anticipation. They looked like starving predators waiting for a cage to be unlocked. My mother kept adjusting her perfect posture, her eyes glued obsessively to the thick manila folder resting on Elias's immaculate desk. My father was rapidly tapping his expensive Italian leather shoes against the hardwood floor, a frantic rhythm of barely contained excitement. They leaned in close to each other, speaking in hushed, feverish tones, already planning how to spend the massive wealth they believed was rightfully theirs. I sat far away in a stiff wooden chair in the darkest corner of the room, keeping my hands tightly folded in my lap. Elias sat behind his massive desk. He did not rush the process. He deliberately adjusted his reading glasses, picked up the heavy document, and cleared his throat. The room went dead, terrifyingly silent. "We are here to read the last will and testament of Arthur and Beatrice Vance," Elias began, his voice completely steady and entirely devoid of emotion. He read slowly through the standard legal jargon, the burial wishes, and the minor charitable donations to local animal shelters. My father's tapping foot suddenly stopped. My mother leaned so far forward her manicured nails were digging deep into the leather of her expensive purse. "And now, to the distribution of the primary estate," Elias continued. He looked up, his sharp eyes meeting mine for a brief, piercing second before returning to the crisp paper. "I leave my entire estate, including the residential and agricultural property in the Willamette Valley, the entirety of my confidential aerospace patent portfolio, and all liquid cash assets totaling exactly $31 million, to one sole beneficiary." Elias paused. The silence in the room was absolute and deafening. "To my granddaughter, Claire Holmes." For 5 agonizing seconds, absolutely nobody moved. The words hung in the sterile air, heavy and impossible. Then, the fragile mask of the grieving family shattered into a million jagged, ugly pieces. The eruption was instantaneous and terrifyingly violent. Richard slammed both his fists onto the glass coffee table so hard the heavy glass groaned. He leaped to his feet, his face turning a dangerous, explosive shade of crimson. "That is an absolute lie," he roared, pointing a shaking, furious finger directly at Elias. "You are lying. That is impossible. They would never, ever leave that kind of money to her. They were senile. Their minds were completely gone. I will sue you into bankruptcy. I will drag this pathetic law firm through the dirt. I will contest this garbage document in every single court in the country. Sylvia whipped her head around to look at me. The carefully constructed elegance vanished instantly, replaced by sheer, unadulterated venom. She stood up, towering over my corner with a look of absolute, terrifying disgust. "You are nothing but a wage-earning bookworm," she screamed, her voice cracking with fury. "You hide in a damp basement, breathing in dust. You have absolutely no ambition, no class, and no idea how to handle real power. You are completely unfit to even touch that money. You will sign every single penny over to us immediately, or I will destroy you." Julian sat completely frozen on the sofa, his jaw slack. The arrogant golden boy suddenly realizing he had been entirely cut out of the script of his own life. Elias did not flinch at the screaming, the threats, or the flying spit. He calmly reached into his locked desk drawer and pulled out a sleek black flash drive and a thick, heavy stack of medical documents. He tossed them onto the center of his desk with a heavy, deeply satisfying thud. "You are entirely welcome to try, Richard," Elias said, his tone dropping to a sub-zero temperature that froze the room. "However, I must inform you that Arthur and Beatrice anticipated exactly this unhinged reaction. What you see here is a comprehensive, bulletproof psychological evaluation conducted by 3 independent, board-certified neurologists. Furthermore, I have a high-definition video recording of both Arthur and Beatrice, detailing their explicit intentions for the estate and confirming their absolute undeniable mental clarity. These documents and videos were executed exactly 3 weeks before their passing." Elias leaned forward, resting his hands flat on the desk, locking eyes with my father. "The estate is ironclad. There is no legal loophole. There is absolutely no contest. The $31 million, the patents, and the land belong entirely to Claire, and there is absolutely nothing you can do about it." The heavy oak doors of Elias Thorne's office had barely clicked shut before my father's fingers wrapped around my upper arm like a steel vise. His grip severely bruised my skin right through the thick fabric of my winter coat, before I could even begin to process the massive shock of the will. Richard and Sylvia practically dragged me down the private elevator and shoved me violently into the back of their tinted black luxury vehicle. The heavy doors slammed shut, and the internal locks engaged with a heavy final sound. The exact moment the engine started, Sylvia leaned over and ripped my cell phone straight out of my hands. "What are you doing?" I demanded, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. "We are protecting you from the inevitable media circus," Sylvia snapped, dropping my phone deep into her designer handbag. Her voice was completely devoid of the screaming hysteria she had just displayed in the law office, replaced instead by a cold, clinical detachment that was far more terrifying. "You are clearly overwhelmed and deeply confused. You are not thinking straight. We are taking you home until you regain your senses." The long drive down the coast to San Francisco was a suffocating, unbearable nightmare. The air inside the spacious vehicle was thick and entirely unbreathable, heavy with the silent, radiating fury of my parents. I was trapped inside a moving steel cage with 2 predators. Hours later, the towering wrought iron gates of their massive, debt-ridden mansion swallowed us whole. They marched me directly into Richard's cavernous, poorly lit study. The heavy mahogany doors slammed shut, sealing us completely inside the soundproof room. The space smelled of expensive scotch and financial desperation. My father marched aggressively over to his massive oak desk, snatched up a thick stack of freshly printed legal papers, and slammed them down on the glass table directly in front of me. The bold black header across the first page read, "Asset Management Power of Attorney." At that moment, Sylvia abruptly changed her tactics. The terrifying venom melted away from her face, replaced by a sickening, syrupy sweetness that made my stomach churn with disgust. She walked slowly behind me, gently placing her manicured hands on my tense shoulders. "Claire, darling, you have to understand," she purred, her voice dripping with fake maternal concern. $31 million is not just money, It is a massive, dangerous target painted right on your back. You do not know how to manage international patent portfolios. You do not know how to handle complex capital gains taxes or corporate structures. Your father manages venture capital funds for a living. Sign the management rights over to his firm. We will give you a very generous monthly allowance. You can go back to your dusty little books in Chicago, and we will handle all the heavy lifting. It is a win for everyone. I stared down at the thick legal document. It was a complete and total surrender. Signing it meant handing over every single cent of my grandparents' hard-earned legacy to feed Richard's fraudulent, crumbling empire. I slowly stood up, sharply shrugging off my mother's hands. For the first time in my entire 28 years of life, I looked my father dead in the eyes and refused to look away. "No," I said quietly, though my voice carried a steady, unbreakable resolve. "I am not signing anything." The fragile mask of the caring father vaporized in an instant. Richard's face twisted into a grotesque portrait of pure, ugly rage. He leaned aggressively across the glass table, his face just inches from mine, his rapid breath smelling of stale coffee and pure malice. "You ungrateful little wretch," he snarled, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous vibration that shook my core. "You think you can play in the big leagues? You think a single piece of paper makes you my equal? You will sign this document, or I will personally grind your pathetic, insignificant life into dust. I will leave you with absolutely nothing." They physically forced me up the stairs and locked me inside the isolated guest bedroom on the 3rd floor. The deadbolt slid into place from the outside with a heavy metallic thud that echoed painfully in my chest. I was a hostage. I pressed my ear flat against the thick wood of the door, listening to the muffled, frantic pacing of my father in the hallway outside. He wasted absolutely zero time making good on his horrific threats. Through the wooden panels, I heard him barking vicious orders into his phone. Within 30 minutes, he had completely severed my access to the meager educational trust fund left over from my college days, which was the absolute only money I used to pay my apartment rent in Chicago. He permanently froze all my credit cards. Then, the true, unspeakable cruelty began. I listened in absolute horror as Richard dialed the direct line of the director of the Hawthorne Institute. My father possessed a silver tongue explicitly built for destroying reputations. He spun a vile, entirely fabricated story about my deteriorating mental instability. He told my boss that I had recently been caught stealing priceless historical artifacts to fund a severe, secret gambling addiction, warning the Institute that they needed to terminate my employment immediately to avoid a massive public relations scandal. In less than 2 hours, my parents had systematically dismantled my entire existence. I had no money, no phone, no job, and no apparent way out. The walls of the luxurious bedroom felt like they were rapidly closing in, crushing my ribs and stealing my oxygen. Around midnight, the heavy deadbolt clicked, the door creaked open, and my older brother Julian slipped quietly into the room. For a brief, foolish second, my heart leaped, thinking he had finally come to help me. But the arrogant, mocking smirk resting on his perfect face shattered that naive illusion instantly. He leaned casually against the doorframe, crossing his arms tightly over his expensive cashmere sweater. "You really messed up this time, Claire," Julian whispered, his voice dripping with heavy condescension. "Did you actually think you could just walk away with the prize? You do not belong at the top of the food chain. You are bottom-feeding plankton. Mom and Dad are going to keep you locked inside this room until you mentally break. They always win. Do not be stupid. Just sign the paper in the morning and beg for their forgiveness before they ruin your life permanently. You are fighting people who are totally out of your league." Julian turned around, walked out into the dark hallway, and locked the heavy door right back up. He was entirely wrong. I was not out of my league. I was just playing a completely different game. I sat perfectly still on the edge of the mattress and waited for another 60 minutes until the massive house fell into complete, dead silence. My family forgot one crucial, fatal detail about my pathetic, dusty little job in Chicago. As a senior antiquities restorer, I spent my long days painstakingly disassembling and repairing extremely complex, centuries-old mechanical puzzle boxes and intricate timepieces. I understood the hidden inner workings of gears, tension springs, and brass tumblers better than anyone alive. The modern, standard-issue deadbolt securing the guest room door was an absolute joke compared to a 19th century French locking mechanism. I pulled a sturdy metal hairpin from my messy hair and snapped it clean in half. I knelt silently on the hardwood floor in the pitch black. I slid the two thin pieces of metal deep into the keyhole, feeling blindly for the internal brass pins. 1, 2, 3, 4, with a soft, barely audible click. The heavy deadbolt completely released. I did not bother packing a bag. I simply grabbed my heavy winter coat and slipped out of the bedroom like a phantom. I knew the blind spots in the mansion's expensive security system perfectly, having spent my entire miserable childhood silently hiding from my family. I ghosted down the narrow back servant stairs, slipped quietly through the side kitchen door, and vanished instantly into the freezing, thick fog rolling off the dark bay. I walked rapidly for 3 exhausting miles in the dead of night until I finally found a brightly lit, 24-hour gas station. I used the last few crumpled dollar bills hiding in my coat pocket to pay a sleepy taxi driver to take me straight to the international airport. By the time the morning sun finally began to rise, exposing the empty, unlocked guest room to my furious, panicking parents, I was already thousands of feet up in the air, securely seated on the earliest morning flight back to the only safe place left on Earth. I was heading straight back to the quiet farm in Oregon. The crisp, pine-scented air of the Willamette Valley filled my lungs the moment I stepped out of the rusted local taxi. The sprawling farm was completely silent, blanketed in a thick, peaceful morning mist. It was the exact opposite of the suffocating glass and steel prison I had just escaped. I walked slowly up the worn wooden steps of the wraparound porch and pushed the heavy oak front door open. I stopped dead in my tracks. Sitting perfectly upright at the rustic kitchen table, calmly sipping black coffee from my grandfather's favorite ceramic mug, was Elias Thorne. Resting on the scarred wooden surface directly in front of him was a massive, incredibly heavy black steel safe. "I figured you would catch the earliest flight out of California," Elias said smoothly, setting his mug down. "Your parents are entirely predictable when they panic. Please, take a seat. We have a great deal of work to do." I slowly sank into a wooden dining chair, staring intensely at the forbidding black box. "How did you know I escaped?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Because Arthur and Beatrice planned for absolutely every single contingency," Elias replied, his sharp eyes locking onto mine. "Your grandparents did not pass away suddenly from old age. Claire, they received terminal cancer diagnoses exactly 10 months ago. They knew their time was rapidly running out. Instead of spending their final days in a sterile hospital ward, they spent every waking hour constructing a brilliant, inescapable trap to expose the rot hiding inside your family." Elias reached forward and quickly spun the heavy metal dial on the front of the safe. The complex locking mechanism clicked loudly. He grabbed the thick steel handle and yanked the heavy door open. Inside were neat stacks of financial ledgers, bound legal briefs, and dozens of digital hard drives. He pulled out a thick red folder and pushed it across the table toward me. "Open it," he commanded quietly. I flipped the heavy cover back. The first page was a highly detailed forensic accounting report, complete with magnified images of property deeds. I immediately recognized my grandparents' signatures at the bottom of the page. But something was terribly wrong. The ink strokes were completely rigid, entirely lacking the fluid, natural movement of my grandfather's hand. "Your parents are not simply greedy narcissists," Elias explained, his voice dropping an octave, taking on the sharp edge of a seasoned investigator. "They are desperate, cornered criminals. 14 months ago, your father's fraudulent tech startup completely collapsed behind closed doors. To keep up their lavish lifestyle and prevent his angry investors from finding out the truth, Richard and Sylvia committed egregious, highly calculated felonies. They secretly forged your grandparents' signatures, manufactured entirely fake notary stamps, and use those fabricated documents to illegally mortgage this exact farm. My jaw tightened as my eyes scanned the damning paperwork. They put a lien on the farm? They used this property as collateral to secure a massive, high-interest loan from a notoriously ruthless shadow venture capital fund, Elias stated grimly. They borrowed exactly $10 million, and the absolute worst part for them is that the balloon payment for that illegal loan is due in exactly 14 days. Suddenly, the blinding, terrifying madness in the San Francisco mansion made perfect, crystal clear sense. The kidnapping, the screaming, the vicious threats, and the coordinated destruction of my career were not just about petty greed. It was about sheer, animalistic survival. If they do not secure your $31 million immediately, they will entirely default on the $10 million loan. I concluded, the pieces of the puzzle snapping together with a violent, satisfying clarity. The venture capital fund will seize this farm. The fake documents will be exposed during the asset transfer, and my parents will be caught red-handed. Exactly. Elias smiled, a cold, predatory gleam in his eye. They are drowning, but Arthur and Beatrice were always 10 steps ahead. They hired elite private investigators to track every single fraudulent wire transfer your father made. They acquired the IP addresses he used to forge the digital signatures. They compiled audio recordings of Sylvia bribing the corrupt notary public. Everything your parents did in the shadows is meticulously documented right here inside this steel box. I stared down at the red folder, my heart pounding a steady, powerful rhythm against my ribs. I was no longer looking at financial records. I was looking at a flawlessly constructed weapon. This entire setup is a dead man's switch, Elias said softly, leaning back in his chair. Arthur and Beatrice built the bomb, but they wanted you to be the one to decide what to do with it. Inside this safe is airtight, undeniable evidence of massive bank fraud, identity theft, and federal wire fraud. The moment these documents are handed over to the authorities, Richard and Sylvia will be facing a minimum of 20 years in federal prison. I ran my fingertips slowly across the cold steel edge of the open safe. For my entire life, I was the terrified prey, constantly running and hiding from their cruelty. But sitting in the quiet warmth of the Oregon farmhouse, the heavy, suffocating chains of my childhood completely shattered. The immense power to completely annihilate the fake empire of Richard and Sylvia Holmes now rested entirely in my two hands, backed into a terrifying, suffocating corner. Richard and Sylvia doubled down on their delusions, with the clock ticking rapidly down on their massive $10 million balloon payment. They orchestrated one final, desperate gamble. They rented out the most exclusive ballroom in downtown San Francisco for a wildly extravagant charity gala. It was a dazzling, expensive illusion designed explicitly to blind new investors and trick them into pouring fresh capital into my father's dead company. The air in that city must have tasted like pure panic disguised as expensive champagne. To bait the trap, they fed a massive lie to the financial press. The morning papers ran bold headlines claiming the newly formed Holmes Family Fund had just received a massive $31 million capital injection. They proudly paraded my name across the financial columns, using my inheritance as the ultimate bait to lure in hungry sharks. They painted a picture of a united, immensely wealthy family ready to conquer the tech world. But the public spectacle was not enough for Richard. He needed my actual signature on the legal documents. 3 days before the gala, strange black vehicles began idling at the edge of my grandparents' property in Oregon. They parked their massive trucks right at the edge of the county road, leaving their headlights burning brightly through my bedroom window all night long. Heavy men in cheap suits stood outside my fence line, chain-smoking and staring menacingly at the farmhouse. My father had hired private fixers to wage a campaign of psychological warfare. They wanted to break my spirit, to terrorize me into believing I had nowhere left to hide. The message was perfectly clear. Fly to San Francisco, attend the gala, sign the power of attorney in front of the investors, or these men would make sure I never felt safe again. In the past, The mere sight of those idling vehicles would have sent me spiraling into a debilitating panic attack. I would have locked every door, hid in a closet, and eventually surrendered just to make the crushing anxiety stop. But the terrified, invisible ghost who used to haunt the halls of the San Francisco mansion no longer existed. I stood by the window, watching the hired thugs, and felt absolutely nothing but a cold, hard resolve. I picked up my phone and called Elias Thorne. I told him I was going back to California. I was going to the gala. But I was not going to surrender. I was going to drop the guillotine. The night of the event, the grand ballroom of the hotel was a suffocating sea of designer tuxedos, glittering diamonds, and relentless, hollow networking. The crystal chandeliers cast a harsh, unforgiving light on the forced smiles and the desperate handshakes. Waiters glided silently across the marble floors, carrying silver trays loaded with expensive caviar and vintage champagne, while the string quartet played a frantic, upbeat symphony that felt entirely out of place. The room pulsed with a frenetic, desperate energy, like the heavy, electric air right before a massive hurricane makes landfall. I did not wear a new designer gown. Instead, I wore my grandmother's vintage emerald green silk dress. The fabric was simple, elegant, and carried the faint, comforting scent of lavender. As I stepped through the massive golden doors, the noisy, superficial chatter of the elite slowly died down. I moved through the crowded room with a slow, deliberate stillness that completely contrasted with the frantic, greedy energy buzzing all around me. I kept my spine perfectly straight and my expression completely unreadable, a sharp blade cutting through a room full of soft, inflated egos. My parents spotted me from across the room. Their eyes lit up with a sickening, victorious greed. They genuinely believed their intimidation tactics had worked perfectly. They thought the fragile little lamb had finally broken under the pressure and crawled right back to the slaughterhouse. Sylvia rushed toward me, her face stretched into a grotesque, painfully wide smile. She threw her arms around my neck, pulling me into a suffocating embrace precisely as the hired event photographers raised their expensive cameras. Flashes of bright white light exploded around us, capturing the perfect, entirely fabricated image of a loving mother and her wealthy daughter. Richard materialized right beside her, gripping my shoulder with that same heavy, bruising force from the lawyer's office, though he kept his face arranged in a mask of proud, paternal joy. "I knew you would finally come to your senses, Claire," he whispered harshly into my ear, his voice completely hidden from the cameras. "The investors are waiting in the private suite upstairs. Do not mess this up." He had absolutely no idea. He was entirely blind to the fact that the older waiter pouring champagne just 10 feet away was Elias Thorne, and he was blissfully unaware that the 6 broad-shouldered men discreetly guarding the ballroom exits were not private hotel security, but heavily armed federal agents waiting for my exact signal. The heavy oak doors of the soundproof VIP suite closed behind us, instantly silencing the frantic string quartet and the noisy chatter of the ballroom below. The room was lavishly decorated with dark leather and brushed brass, smelling strongly of expensive cigars and predatory ambition. Seated around a massive, polished mahogany conference table were 3 older men in immaculate, custom-tailored suits. These were the shark investors, the deep-pocketed targets Richard desperately needed to keep his sinking ship afloat. My father practically shoved me into a high-backed leather chair at the head of the table. He stood over me, his chest puffed out with a sickening, victorious pride. He reached into the inner pocket of his tuxedo jacket, pulled out a heavy gold-plated designer pen, and threw it aggressively onto the table. It clattered loudly against the glass surface. Next to it sat the exact same thick legal document from the mansion, the Asset Management Power of Attorney. "Gentlemen, as promised," Richard announced, his voice dripping with smooth, practiced charisma. "My daughter has finally agreed to consolidate the newly acquired $31 million estate into the Holmes Family Fund. We are ready to proceed with the primary capital injection." He leaned down, placing his hands flat on the table, glaring at me with eyes full of venom. "Sign the paper, darling," he hissed through a painfully fake smile. I looked at the shiny gold pen. Then I looked up at the three investors, who were watching me with hungry, expectant eyes. For a long, silent moment, I did absolutely nothing. I just sat there, feeling the steady, powerful beating of my own heart. I felt no fear. I felt absolutely no anxiety. The suffocating ghost of my childhood was entirely gone, replaced by a cold, unbreakable steel. A small, genuine smile touched the corners of my mouth. I calmly reached into my vintage silk handbag. "I am afraid there has been a slight misunderstanding," I said clearly, my voice ringing out steady and strong in the quiet room. "I did not come here to sign anything." I did not pull out a pen. I pulled out 3 thick, heavily stapled packets of paper. Perfect replicas of the devastating forensic accounting reports Elias had shown me back in Oregon. With a swift, decisive motion, I tossed the heavy packets straight down onto the polished mahogany table. They slid smoothly across the glass, stopping directly in front of the 3 investors. "What I brought," I continued, staring dead into the eyes of the lead investor, "is the absolute truth about the man standing next to me." The lead investor frowned, picking up the top document. His seasoned, calculating eyes rapidly scanned the first page. The color drained from his face instantly. The other 2 men grabbed their copies, reading the undeniable proof of forged deeds, fake notary stamps, and a desperate, illegal $10 million loan secured by stolen property. These were ruthless, highly experienced businessmen. It took them less than 30 seconds to realize they were sitting in a room with a desperate, cornered criminal trying to use them to pay off a massive, fraudulent debt. "Richard," the lead investor growled, standing up abruptly and throwing the document back onto the table. "What on earth is this? Is this a joke?" The polished, charismatic mask of Richard Holmes completely evaporated, raw. Naked panic seized his face. He began to stammer uncontrollably, his hands shaking violently as he reached for the papers. No, that is entirely fabricated. That is a total lie. My daughter is deeply unwell. She is having a severe mental breakdown." Sylvia let out an ear-piercing shriek. The elegant society woman completely vanished, replaced by a feral, unhinged animal. She lunged aggressively across the table, her manicured nails clawing frantically at the documents, desperately trying to tear the thick pages into pieces. "Give me those, you ungrateful little monster! I will kill you!" she screamed, spit flying from her lips, before her hands could even rip the first page. The heavy VIP room doors violently burst open. The heavy wood slammed loudly against the walls. The room froze. Standing in the doorway was Elias Thorne, completely ditching his waiter disguise, his sharp eyes burning with righteous fury. Flanking him on both sides were 6 federal agents, wearing dark tactical vests with the bright yellow letters FBI stamped across their chests. Their hands rested heavily on their holstered weapons. "Richard and Sylvia Holmes," the lead agent announced, his booming voice echoing like thunder in the small room. "Step entirely away from the table and keep your hands where we can see them. You are both under arrest for multiple counts of federal wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and bank fraud." The silence that followed was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard in my entire life. It was the sound of a fake empire completely crumbling into dust. Sylvia collapsed onto her knees, sobbing hysterically, her designer gown pooling around her on the floor. Richard stood frozen, staring blankly at the federal agents, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. The federal agents moved in swiftly, grabbing their arms and locking heavy steel handcuffs securely around their wrists. The metallic clicks echoed loudly in the room. The final, undeniable period at the end of their twisted story. They dragged my parents out of the VIP suite and marched them straight toward the grand staircase. I followed closely behind, flanked by Elias. As we reached the top of the stairs, I looked down at the hallway below. Julian was standing there, his face entirely pale and completely soaked in tears. The arrogant, untouchable golden child had finally realized that the bank accounts were frozen, the trust funds were a lie, and his entire life of unearned luxury was completely over. He was left with absolutely nothing. The agents paraded Richard and Sylvia right through the center of their own lavish gala. The string quartet stopped playing. The entire ballroom fell into a stunned, breathless silence. Hundreds of high society elites, the very people my parents had spent their entire lives trying to impress, stood holding their expensive champagne glasses, watching in utter shock as the Holmes family was dragged out in handcuffs. 6 months later, the oppressive fog of San Francisco felt like a distant, faded nightmare. I did not quit my job. Instead, I returned to the basement archives of the Hawthorne Institute in Chicago, breathing in the comforting scent of ancient paper. However, I was no longer just a senior restorer struggling to pay rent. I used a portion of my inheritance to establish a massive, fully independent heritage conservation fund, securing the Institute's future for the next 50 years. But my real home was not in the city. My home was the quiet, sprawling farm in the Willamette Valley. I spent my weekends walking through the hazelnut orchards, watching the morning mist roll over the Oregon hills. I was surrounded by good, honest colleagues, the sharp but deeply caring guidance of Elias Thorne, and genuine neighbors who valued hard work over expensive zip codes. My parents were both convicted and sentenced to serve 20 years in a federal penitentiary. They would spend the rest of their lives locked inside a concrete box, stripped of all the wealth and status they worshipped, standing on the wooden porch of the farmhouse, holding my grandfather's old ceramic coffee mug. I finally understood the truth. The $31 million was an incredible gift, but it was not the greatest inheritance Arthur and Beatrice Vance left me. The true legacy was the absolute freedom to finally breathe, the courage to shatter my chains, and the beautiful, quiet life I had chosen entirely for myself. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. We hope you enjoyed it. As an ad-free channel, your support is what keeps us alive. Please support Maya Revenge Stories with just $1 via the QR code on the screen, or click the link in the description box or pinned comment. Also, we'd love to connect with you. Please leave a comment telling us which city or state you're listening from. Thank you for standing with us, and see you in the next stories.